And so there you have this dilemma of what do we want about this thing that is substantially unpopular and has been unpopular since the day it was passed. But where our poll and national polls have found that doesn't mean the public really favors the throw it out strategy, at least not a majority does. So I think it's nothing but complicated and does not admit an easy solution to it.
And Charles, we will be polling again several times before the election.
Yes. Keep an eye on the website. We put up an announcement about a week to 10 days or so before the events, and stay tuned.
And we'll also encourage you to check out the website, law.marquette.edu. We'll have all the results you can see, all the questions, all the crosstabs, everything for you folks who really enjoy politics. It's all there for you to peruse on the website. Also some posts about the poll and what it might say about where Wisconsin voters are at this moment in time will also be available on the law school faculty blog. Yes?
Can I just jump in?
Oh, sure.
We are posting both the likely voter and the registered voter results there, and the crosstabs for both of those for you Uber geeks that have to look at crosstabs. And we've added HTML tables to the crosstabs if you don't like the text formatting. Let me know if it works or fails.
Hey, Jeff, thanks so much for your time, your interest, and Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Duchesne. With me is Professor Charles Franklin, who is the director of the Marquette Law School poll. We are today releasing the results of the latest law school poll. We'll look at a number of issues, including the governor's race, the attorney general's race, and we'll also take the temperature of the state of Wisconsin on a number of major policy questions. So let's get right to it. We'll begin by asking Charles about the sample size when we were in the field and the margin of error. Charles?
There we go. It seems like old times.
It is old times.
So we were in the field last Thursday through Sunday, August 21st to 24th. We interviewed 815 registered voters by both landline and cell phone, randomly selected around the state. For the sample of likely voters, that sample, the margin of error for the 815 is plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. And for the likely voter sample, we have 609 likely voters with a margin of error of plus or minus 4.1%. As we're going through things, most of what we'll talk about is registered voters on public opinion, and we'll show you both registered and likely voters on things like vote choice. But unless we're telling you explicitly we're looking at likely voters here, you should assume we're talking about the full sample of registered voters.
Well, we have a lot of information we want to share with you, so we're going to go through these slides at a fairly reasonable pace. And we're going to begin with the horse race, the governor's race, the race between Democrat Mary Burke and Republican incumbent Scott Walker. And Charles, why don't you give us a little perspective, the last two polls, and then what we have for this poll.
So the litany that you've heard for the last two polls in May and in July is inside the margin of error. We've seen after March, when Governor Walker had a modest lead in upper single digits, we saw the race tighten. So here are the May data, and here on the left you see the registered voter sample, which was Burke at 45.7, Walker 46, so 46-46 with rounding, tie among registered voters. Governor Walker, though, had a bit of a lead, again with rounding, 48-45, among likely voters. So, and again, both of those were inside the margin of error. In July, things had hardly moved. There, among registered, Walker was at 46, Burke at 45. Among likelies, though, Burke was at 47 and Walker at 46. So a 1-point margin one way for Walker among registered voters, a 1-point margin for Burke among likely voters, deep inside the margin of error. So where are we today? Are we still there? Yes, sir, we are. It's actually quite striking how little has changed. Among registered voters, though, that Walker advantage that was 1 point in July is now a 3.4 percentage point difference. Remember, our margin of error is 3.5, so inside the margin of error. Just a slightly bigger margin, though, than last time for registered voters. But for likely voters, it's Burke 48.6 to Walker 46.5, a 2.1 percentage point Burke advantage among the likely voters compared to the 1 point last time. And so, well within the margin of error in both of these cases. If you look at those three in a row, and especially if you compare them to, say, the Senate campaign in 2012, where we saw such huge shifts with Thompson ahead at the primary and then Tammy Baldwin taking the lead after the post-primary period. We saw a lot of movement in those. In contrast, the last 3 months of the governor's race have been remarkably flat. None of these changes from month to month are statistically significant, and none of the margins between the two candidates is statistically significant.
Let's go inside these numbers, Charles, and talk about the vote according to party ID, and we'll look at both registered and likely voters.
And that would work just great if I hadn't lost track of where I was on my page. So here we go. This is the vote by party ID for registered voters. We see the same pattern we've seen for a long time, that partisans are very strongly attached to their candidate. 94% of Republicans going with Walker, 89% of Democrats going with Burke. What we saw last time was that the margin among registered voters for Walker and Burke had narrowed somewhat. Now they're a little bit wider. It's a 9-point advantage here for Walker, 48 to 39 among registered voters. When we switch to likely voters, though, we see two things, one really important thing change. Look at the party loyalties now, they're essentially dead even. 96% of likely Republican voters going with Walker, 95% of likely Democratic voters going with Burke. That advantage in party loyalty for Burke among the likely voters is a tick up and is revealing when you think about just this little bit of motion we see between last time and this time. She's picking up some here by having just about as completely as Walker has, as anyone could, solidifying the base. To a lesser extent, the independent margin is just a little bit smaller. It's a 6-point margin among likely voters compared to the 9-point among registered. But there, Governor Walker continues to maintain a small edge among independents.
For the first time, we have polled in the Attorney General's race. We now know that the major party candidates are set. Susan Happ, who's the Democratic candidate, she's the Jefferson County DA. And you have Brad Schimmel, who's the Waukesha County DA, and he's the Republican candidate. We began by asking people if they have a favorable or unfavorable impression, and I think we found that this is one of those races that we're still sort of becoming familiar with.
We might need a little time to get to know these people. So 73% say they've not heard of Susan Happ or not heard enough about her. Another 9% say they don't know enough. They can't say if they have a favorable or unfavorable. So I add those two together, that's 82% that can't give you an opinion about her.
And this is after a primary.
And this is after winning a primary in all 72 counties with 52% of the vote, right? It was a pretty impressive primary win. But don't forget, I think the GAB put out the number yesterday, 12.7%, 12.7% turnout. So it's not as if massive hordes of voters got to know any of the candidates by voting in the primary. However, the favorability is net favorable, but with such tiny numbers that have opinions. Net favorable 12 to unfavorable 7. When we move to Brad Schimmel, we see a very similar picture, slightly higher, not heard at 76 plus 11 don't know, so that's 87 unfamiliar with him, but then he didn't just come through a primary, so if you want a primary bounce, there it is, that very small addition of knowledge about Hack compared to Schimmel, and an 8-5 favorable, unfavorable split. So this race clearly has a long ways to go for voters to get to know these people. And I'm sure the Burke campaign will be pleased that there's somebody else even less known than she has been with that 70% don't know rate that we started out the year with. Well, this kind of puts that 70% in perspective. Her 70 at the beginning of the race was actually a lot better than these two at this stage. So lots of learning to do.
So we did put them in a head-to-head matchup because it's sort of interesting. We identified them as their respective party candidates.
It's worth noting that when we ask the favorable, unfavorable, we deliberately do not give their party or the office that they hold, because the purpose of the favorable question is to find out if you know who this person is from just the name. But on the vote question, for all vote questions, we always say, will you vote for Susan Happ, the Democrat, or Brad Schimmel, the Republican? So that provides the party cue, and at least lets people become a little oriented. Plus, they know that these are people running for the Attorney General's race, because we say what they're running for. In that, Happ has a modest lead, 40-33, but as you'd imagine from the don't know rates on the previous two slides, an awful lot of undecided, 16 undecided and another 8 that say they don't know. So a quarter of registered voters still very much not thinking about this race. When we move to the likely voters, it actually doesn't change that much. 42 for Happ, 32 for Schimmel, and on the don't know side, it's now 23% combining the undecided and the don't know. So call it a quarter that still are nowhere close to making up their minds in the AG's race.
Let's shift back to the governor's race for a moment. As everyone in this room knows, Democrats are questioning the job creation record of the governor. You've seen the ads. They talk about Wisconsin being last in the Midwest. The governor's just issued a new ad that says, according to monthly numbers, we're third in the Midwest. So there's this back and forth on job creation. We've been asking about this for a series of months. Charles, why don't we get into that for a few minutes?
So if we back up to May, and I'm going to focus mostly on the lagging number since that's sort of the core of the debate between the two. 43% lagging, that's about where that number had been since January, when I think it hit its recent low of 40. But it had been in the low 40s in the fall, in October, 40 in January. You can see 43 here in May. With a big clump of people, 38% here saying about the same, keeping up with other states. And finally, a small minority of about 13% saying we're adding jobs faster. That hardly changed when we went to July, despite some of that campaign debate beginning to take place at the time. Still 43 lagging, a little more in the same, a little fewer in jobs faster, but not any movement in the lagging. Now we've gone another month with, I would say, even more intense advertising directly confronting the jobs issue. And now there has been a little bit of movement on that, from 43% lagging to 48% lagging, with the same at 34 and faster now under 10 at 8%. So a little bit of movement there. In the spring of 2013, we saw lagging at 49, which is the highest we've ever seen it. And then it fell off in the fall and winter of this past year. So this is not quite as high as we've seen it in the time we've been asking the question, but it's back towards the high end. And given how modest the movement has been on some of the other items, like the vote question, seeing a 5-point move here on this item, I think is suggesting a little bit of a campaign effect.
We asked about a number of issues in this poll, but we also asked about some things that have been in the news lately. And let's talk about one of those. Many of you are familiar because of the television ads with the debate over outsourcing. This goes back to what Trek Bicycle has done, building some of its bikes. In fact, the majority of its bikes overseas, some in China, some in Holland, some in Germany. So we wanted to find out what public attitudes are about outsourcing. Charles, we asked a couple of questions.
Sure. So we started by offering people two rather stark contrasts between options. One is to say that outsourcing reduces jobs and holds down wages, or outsourcing is necessary for businesses to be competitive in the world, and choose one. Overwhelmingly, people choose that outsourcing holds down jobs and depresses wages, 73% on that, just 20% agreeing that this is necessary as a fact of life for businesses. I should say these are not terribly surprising numbers in comparison with national polling as well. It's pretty hard to find anyone who's in favor of outsourcing, which probably is a good reason why it's effective in campaign ads to raise outsourcing when so many people we know from other data have a negative view about it. Here we see that in the state, it's 3/4 to a fifth see the negative side. But then we also asked about whether state government can offer economic incentives to corporations or to companies that can persuade them not to outsource jobs, or, again, the alternative choice, businesses really have little choice but to outsource in order to be competitive. Here, voters are quite a bit more positive about the potential for state government to offer incentives, financial incentives to corporations to change their outsourcing practices, though 38% now still say, in fact, a little more than the 20% before, say that that's not effective, that businesses don't have much choice.
There are some people, Charles, who think this race will come down to a simple question, and that is who's best able to help the state create jobs, Mary Burke or Scott Walker? We asked a very simple question. And I guess the answer is not terribly surprising.
Not terribly surprising.
Given the horse race results, yeah.
Okay, they're tied. 45-45, dead even. And, clearly you have a hard time watching the campaign over the last couple of months and not think this is all about jobs. Maybe that will shift as we go through the campaign. But at the moment, despite all the different results we've just gone through, these two candidates are seen dead even on that.
Try to get a sense of how people in the state are doing and how they feel about the direction of the state. Let's start with people's personal finances, Charles.
Sure. The idea of recovery, that we're doing better, that we've certainly seen economic indicators, improvements over time, and unemployment coming down, for example. This question we've been asking since January of 2012 in almost every poll, and it says, how did the recession affect your personal finances? Did it have a major impact and your finances have still not recovered? Did it have a major impact but you've now mostly recovered? Or did the Great Recession not have much of an impact on your personal finances? And where we stand now is 24% saying they've still not recovered, 33% saying they're back, but it was tough at the time, and 42% saying they really weren't that much affected by the recession. This not recovered has been trending slowly down over the 3 years that we've been doing the poll, but has been hovering in the mid-20s for the last several months. So this represents not much of a change, but it certainly illustrates that there is a significant fraction, 24% anyway. You still don't feel like they fully recovered from the recession.
Something that sort of feeds off of that question is the standard right direction, wrong track question. What direction is the state moving in? What do we find?
And this is the first of a series of global looks at how's the state doing. So, as we've seen for the last several months, the majority say the state's headed in the right direction, 54% right direction, 42% wrong track, basically unchanged from last month. A positive evaluation, one that incumbents at least usually take as a good sign, and it's certainly interpreted that way in the public profession usually.
How do people feel about the state's fiscal condition or budget
And a
situation?
second part of the current argument is the budget is in better shape. And for the most part, people agree with that. 45% say this budget is better than it was a few years ago. 26% say it's about the same, and 22% say it's worse now. Those numbers have bounced around by 2 or 3 percentage points, but they're not changing in any dramatic way. And so a small group over here, just about a fifth, that are still worried quite a bit about the budget, but a big plurality, not quite half, seeing the state's budget in better shape.
There are a fair number of changes that have occurred in Wisconsin in the last 3.5 years. How do people feel in general about those changes?
Yeah, we tried to design a question that tried to pull everything together. And instead of giving people a laundry list of this and this and this and this, we just said, thinking about all the changes that have taken place in the state, in state government in the last 4 years, do you think these changes will make the state better off in the long run or worse off in the long run? And there, people, by a modest margin, but a small majority, 51%, say these changes, whatever they have in mind when they say that, will make the state better off in the long run. So if you put those three together, you see the evidence that says Wisconsin may not be overwhelmingly optimistic, but a majority across these items sees a positive side in the current state of the state and in how it's moved over the last 4 years.
So I guess the question would be asked, how do these findings translate into the way people feel about the governor, whether they have a favorable or unfavorable impression of it?
And this is the puzzle, if you will, of this part of the race, because certainly I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen the governor's commercials that say it's working, we're coming back, and so on, which you've just seen some evidence for why that's a reasonable campaign message. But it's not translating into his job approval. In July, the approval was 47, disapproval 48. Just one, dead even, really. But this month, it's 47-47. No change. And so a little bit of the mystery here, and we've talked about it before, and we'll surely be talking about it again, is how is it that people have this kind of positive view of the global picture in the state, but it's not carrying over into a job approval rate that's equally positive.
We pull on a number of policy questions, a number of legislation issues. And let's begin with voter ID, a matter which is still tied up in court apparently. I'll say that with the caveat that things could change, but it is apparently not going to be in effect for the November election. But people in this state, we pulled on this, and they've been pretty consistent in their feelings about it.
People have been very consistent. This is one of the issues that works very strongly for Governor Walker and the Republicans in the legislature. 63% favor of photo ID as a requirement to vote, 32% oppose. We've seen very little movement on this since the issue came up in the spring of 2012. Right around 60% support for the ID, somewhere in the low to mid-30s of opposition. There are other ways you could talk about the question, but just stated this way, have it or not have it, support has been quite strong. Again, this is in line with most national polling on this issue as well.
Act 10, this is the governor's signature legislation that eliminated most collective bargaining for public employees in the state. It's now been in effect for a little while. It certainly divided the state several years ago, and our polling results indicate people still are divided on it.
Surprise, surprise. The way we asked this one, again, of course, Act 10 is a complex piece of legislation. There are multiple pieces to it. So we simply focused on reminding people that Act 10 had largely eliminated collective bargaining for public employees and asked, would you like to see collective bargaining restored to what it was before or kept as it is now, in the limited form that it is now. And 44% would restore collective bargaining, 46% would keep it as it is. We've not asked this question for several, for 2 years. We had last asked it around the recall. The numbers support for Act 10 was slightly higher then, but again, this is a very modest difference. It was a close divide then, with just a little more support for it, but less than 50%. And so I don't think we're seeing much change. We're really seeing that people did make up their minds on this and haven't been persuaded to change them in the last couple of years.
One of the decisions the governor had to make was whether or not to accept money for Medicaid expansion from the federal government as part of the Affordable Care Act. He chose not to. He said he's going to go in a different direction, wasn't convinced that the money would be there over time, and has gone with something that he says will ensure that all people living in poverty will be covered, but people who are above the poverty rate will have to go into exchanges and buy their health care there. So he went a different route. We asked people about the Medicaid expansion issue. Yes.
And a substantial majority say we should accept the federal money and expand the program. Just 29% say we should reject it. We asked this question with a somewhat different wording about a year ago and got very similar results. The support for accepting the money is almost identical at 58. In that previous survey, support for rejecting, if you will, the reject side was a little bit higher. So the accept has hardly moved. The reject has maybe come down a little bit. But because the question is worded differently, you don't want to be too fussy about exact comparisons. I think the point is a pretty substantial chunk of the public thinks that we should accept the expansion of Medicaid.
We'll talk about timing, Charles said. I think I'm going to put a question in here about the Kenosha Casino. And if you've read the paper today or on the various websites, you'll see that's back in the news. Potawatomi have decided to withhold $25 million in payments to the state. They're not happy about the possibility of a casino in Kenosha run by another tribe. But the people in the state weighed in our poll, and the majority kind of like it.
This is literally the very last question that I got onto the poll, and it required to grovel and beg with people that put it together. So, however, it wasn't skill, it was blind luck. I just thought, well, you know, the anniversary's coming up, we should do something.
You're destroying the city.
Yeah, I know. These people know me. They know it's all luck. So what have we got? Approve of the casino 49, reject 35. That's actually down a little bit on the reject side. We had seen this fairly close a year ago when the issue first bubbled up. And then the last time we polled on it, the gap had widened a bit, and now it's widened just a little bit more, so that we're at a 14-point plurality favoring accepting or approving, approving the casino.
But the support for this really varies on which part of the state you're talking about.
And the regional breakdown is maybe the most interesting because the city of Milwaukee, which had been quite opposed at the beginning, now looks just like the rest of the Milwaukee media market, which includes Kenosha and also going north of, and west of the city, of course. Both of those are at 60% urging approval and 29 and 25% saying that the casino should be rejected. The biggest opposition is in the Madison market, though it's just a 40% favor, 43% opposed, so not much of a difference there. Green Bay is a little positive, though not as positive as the Southeast is, at 47-41. And then the rest of the state, which is both the west from La Crosse north and over to Wausau, basically Ron Kind and Sean Duffy's districts, if you want to, for the Congress jocks out there. Those folks are dead even 40-40. So there's been a little bit of evolution, and it's especially been evolution in the city.
Another timely question. We've all seen the TV ads, and sometimes you see these ads and you don't know who's paying for it. You don't know who bought the time. And so we wanted to find out, you know, how people felt about that. Should there be disclosure of who's really paying for these ads?
So this is obviously also an evolving point of law. And so where are we going on disclosure and fundraising regulation and so on? So it's a very interesting area. The way we asked the question was, we opened by saying various groups buy advertising, and at the end of the ad have to say who paid, who sponsored the ad, the name of the group that sponsored the ad. Some states now also require them to list the top donors to their group at the end of the ad, or as part of the ad. Do you think Wisconsin should change and require that disclosure? Should list the top donors of the group. 21% say it should not. Now, we also did this as an experiment. So half of the sample, about 400 people with a margin of error of 5 points, got this question exactly. For the other half, we inserted one phrase. Before we said various groups buy advertising, we said various out-of-state groups buy advertising. That's the only change in the wording. It was not repeated later in the question, so it was just asked that one time. But the addition of the out-of-state stimulus boosts that to 83% favoring disclosure and 14% opposing disclosure. And so, as you know, as I said, this is a lively area of debate in the law nationally, not just here in Wisconsin. The evolution of court doctrine about this is something that's very dynamic and, as a geek, just fun and interesting to watch. But it's also a practical matter, and when you see, at least on this particular issue, that public opinion is still pretty strongly in favor of disclosure of contributions.
Charles, we touched on the outsourcing issue earlier. We asked a couple of questions about Trek, the bicycle company. This is the company that Mary Burke's father founded. And it has been, depending on your point of view, sort of caught in the crossfire here, the back and forth between the candidates. How do people feel about Trek? Do they know it? Do they have any feelings about it?
Yeah, a lot of the rhetoric on both sides is talk about Trek as a beloved Wisconsin company. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but 46% said they hadn't heard enough about Trek to have an opinion. Another 11% said they don't know. So that's 57% that really don't get up every morning and hop on their Trek bicycle to ride to work. Of those who have heard, though, the net favorable is quite strong, 32% to 9% unfavorable. We obviously have never asked about Trek bicycle before, so we don't have a before and after comparison. Right. But we can look at it among partisans and see how that difference holds up. On the face of it, I wouldn't expect there to be a partisan divide if we had asked about Trek 5 years ago or something. But there is a bit of a divide now. 23% of Republicans are favorable, but 16% of Republicans have an unfavorable view of Trek. Among Democrats, it's overwhelmingly positive, 39 to 2. And among independents, it's quite positive, 36 to 8. So again, we don't know where these numbers would have been 6 months or a year ago, but it does seem clear that to the extent that negative views of Trek have been developed in the last however long, that those negative views are predominantly among Republicans raising negativity towards the company, and Democrats perhaps clustering in solidarity with the daughter of the county.
Back to the issues, and this comes from the mixed messages department. We saw that people wanted us to take the federal money to expand Medicaid, but how do they feel about the Affordable Care Act or the new health care law, or Obamacare, whichever you prefer to call it?
Still don't like it. 36% favorable, 53 unfavorable. It's actually a slight uptick in unfavorable and decline in favorable from when we asked about it last time. Not a big change, but a little bit of change. So to the extent that we certainly saw approval go way down during the botched rollout of the healthcare websites, then we saw it recover a bit. Now it's down just a little bit from that last time, though not a whole lot. but an idea that it's steaming ahead and getting much more favorable is not supported by our data at all.
In some parts of the country, in particular, there's been a big push to raise the minimum wage. We've been pulling on this off and on, Charles, over the last year or so. What did we find this time around?
Not a whole lot of change. Still in the upper 50s of support for increasing the minimum wage. I'll remind you that in this question we say some people say the minimum wage, an increase in minimum wage would help people with limited means. Other people say it would hurt jobs and raise unemployment. So the question is balanced between those two options. Still, 57% continue to say they would support an increase in minimum wage. 36% oppose it.
On tax cuts, I would say that there seems to be at least some skepticism on the part of the public about tax cuts, even though we all like our tax cuts.
We absolutely like our tax cuts. We've polled several times on the three different elements of tax cuts that were enacted by the governor and the legislature in the last legislative year, biennium. And we consistently got support for those tax cuts in the 55 to upper 50s range. So solid majority with disapproval, not in the upper 40s, but in the lower 40s or even the upper 30s. So, when it comes to these specific tax cuts, they're not massively popular, but it's a solid majority that favor them. But on the same questionnaires, when we asked this question in the past, we got essentially the same result. Do tax cuts benefit the poor, the middle class, or the wealthy? And so there's sort of a stunning disconnect between 59% saying tax cuts mostly benefit the wealthy. That is not changing very much in public attitudes. You can see elements of political discourse that may bring this into the realm of debate even more prominently. But it is an interesting divide between how we see the tax cuts that we benefit from, or at least we certainly believe we benefited from over the last 2 years, versus how do we see, in this broader picture, who benefits from it.
Alan Borsick, our colleague, asked if we put a couple of questions about Common Core in this poll. As many of you know, that's an emerging issue in the world of education. Some people are very much in favor of these education standards. Some people think states should come up with their own standards and not go with this current description of Common Core as we know it. How is this registered on the public's radar, Charles?
So the first question is knowledge. How much do you know about Common Core? We asked this the first time this past January, so here are those numbers. And I want you to just focus on the know-nothings on the right. The people that say they've heard nothing at all about Common Core. And just the name, but nothing else, the 10% next to that. And now here's this month's data. And so nothing has come down about 10% from 36% that said they'd heard nothing about it 8 months ago to a quarter, 26% that still say they haven't. Though just the name has flipped up a little bit. So that means the net over here with quite a bit in some, you can see quite a bit has gone up by 8 points. Some has gone up by a couple of points. So there has been some learning, some learning about Common Core. It's hardly a massive blinders falling from the eyes, but people are beginning to become a little more familiar with the idea.
And what's our reaction then to it? Is it a favorable reaction, unfavorable? How do people
A little bit. So here's January again. Look at the very unfavorable over there on the right, the deep opposition to it, which made up just 8% in January. Now it makes 12%. So on the one hand, you could say, well, that's a 50% increase from 8% to 12%. It's still a fairly modest group that's deeply opposed. On the unfavorable side, which was at 26 in January, actually dropped down a little bit to 22. So the result is you put these two together on the opposition side, the unfavorable, and you're at 34 in August, and guess what? You were at 34 in January as well. So there's not much movement on the net favorable or unfavorable view there seems to be a little bit of shifting in the intensity of feelings about it.
There's very much a gender gap in evidence in the big races in the state this year. Charles, why don't you walk through both the results for registered and likely voters in both the governor's and the attorney general's
Right.
races?
And so here we're coming back to votes. So I want to split the registered voters from the likely voters. So for registered voters, as we have seen repeatedly in the past, men are going pretty strongly for Governor Walker, women going a bit less strongly, but clearly, for Mary Burke. That's 39% for Burke among men versus 54 men going for Walker. It's 49 women for Burke, 42 for Walker. One of the things that I try to say every time we talk about the gender gap is to remind people that the gender gap's not just about women, it's also about men. And when you're piling up a lopsided majority with one side, it can mitigate any kind of loss with the other side, and that of course works for both. The Burke people would presumably like to do a little better among men. The Walker people would like to do a little better among women. Both of those would have the same effect. But here the difference between the registered voters and the likely voters is a little striking. Because when we move to likely voters, it becomes much more symmetric and a little more split as well. Burke gets 40% of the men to 57% for Walker among men. But now, among likely voters, Burke gets 56% of the women's vote to Walker's 38%. So the margin between these two becomes very similar and very symmetric. And that's something that, when you just look at the registered voters, is not as striking. It's much more striking about the people who tell us they're absolutely sure they're going to the polls this November.
And we see the same trend in the attorney general's race.
Yes, a little more muted, not surprisingly, given what people don't know about the race. But in the AG's race, among men, 34% for Hap, 40% for Schimmel. Among women, it's 44% for Hap and only 26% for Schimmel. So here, the bigger gap is among women. When we were looking at the registered voters for the governor's race, the bigger gap was among men. So there's a little bit more of an effect here among women. And when we switch to likely voters, it becomes even a little more striking. The difference among men actually reduces to 36 of men for Hap, 40% for Schimmel, but among women, 48 for Hap and just 25% for Schimmel. So again, from those slides about favorability and how many people don't know much about this race, we're a long ways from settling this race. But it's starting out in our two female candidates at the top of the ticket on the Democratic side, that we are certainly seeing some gender roles or effects of gender being played out. And those are stronger among the voters that are most likely to go to the polls, a little bit weaker among the registered voter population as a whole.
You mentioned a moment ago, Charles, and something we talked about at past polling events, that for some time people did not seem to know a lot about Mary Burke. That is now starting to change. We've seen some movement in the last couple of years.
We saw 70% not know her in January. It came down to 59, then 51, and then in the last poll, 49% who said they didn't know enough about her to have an opinion. That little bit of movement between May and July was a little bit of a surprise. Now movement has picked up and that awareness has continued to build. That's the July data, let me just skip that. So the not heard and don't know is 31.4. So 35% now don't know enough about her, down from the 49% a month ago. So that's a pretty significant uptick in her recognition, decline in not knowing her. Her net favorability was a +2 a month ago. It's a +1 now, so essentially unchanged.
So up we go.
To get to the right place, again, you all know this, everybody's heard of him. So in July, 45 favorable, 47 unfavorable. This time, dead even, 48 favorable, 48 unfavorable. So no movement, the same story we told about the candidates at the beginning. We've seen some shifts on a few issues and a few awareness issues. We haven't seen a shift in party balance over these last three polls.
Sorry, Charles, we asked a few questions about the traits in the two candidates, and a question that we've asked before, I call the empathy question, is whether or not people feel that the candidate cares about someone like them. What did we find for Burke and for Walker?
So Burke has had a net favorable or net positive view on these. In July, it was 38-31 that she cared about people like them, but with 30% not knowing what they thought. Now, it's 43-35, so it was a 7-point positive last time, it's an 8-point this time. Again, hardly any change. But the don't know rate has come down from the 30% to the 21%, in keeping with people beginning to pick up greater information about her. Governor Walker has been a little bit underwater on this measure. In July, 45 said he cares, 49 said he did not. That was in keeping with the May poll as well. This time, it's hardly changed. 45 cares, 50 does not care. So not a significant movement here, but also no immediate evidence of unraveling that picture up or changing it, nor, for that matter, of it moving more against him over time either. Like all these other things, has hardly changed.
Another question, this one sort of relates to the quality of being decisive. Does Mary Burke get things done? Does Scott Walker get things done? What do we find?
A lot of people don't know about Burke, but they have a net favorable view of her on getting things done. That has increased a little bit over the month, and again, the don't know has come down. But this is where Governor Walker excels. 66% in July said he gets things done. 68% now do. And so if you're thinking about that administrative quality of producing what you want to get done, voters are overwhelmingly of the view. And of course, with 66 or 68%, this has got to include a lot of people that are not supporting it at this point, right? But nevertheless, say that this characteristic of his of getting things done describes him well.
We're going to really spend the remainder of our time on this I guess, call it a distinction between the likely voter and the less likely voter. And let's begin, Charles, by finding out just how likely people say they are to vote in this election. See if there's been any change over time.
Sure. So in July, so the question is, thinking about the election in November, are you absolutely certain you're going to vote? Are you very sure you'll vote? Is there a 50-50 chance? Or will you probably not vote? So those are the options that we give people. And we categorize the people who say they're certain to vote as likely voters. I'm going to show you before we're finished today the differences between these groups, so stay tuned for that. But you can see that in July, 68% of the sample said they were certain to vote. That's down from the mid-80s in the run-up to the November presidential election 2 years ago. Midterm elections always have a lower turnout. We're seeing that showing up in our data as well, with significantly fewer people saying they're certain to vote. But since July, there's been a bit of an uptick in that to 75% saying they're certain. Now, this does not mean we will have 75% voter turnout rate, because not everybody that says they're absolutely certain actually will be able to make it to the polls. Plus, some of those people who say they may not can turn up at the polls. But, and also this is a sample of registered voters, not the adult population. So the turnout rate's a good deal higher than what you may be used to thinking about if you're 52% or 58% turnout rates. That's of adults 18 and over, not of registered voters. So, having said that, there's a little bit of an uptick in involvement in the race.
About enthusiasm.
And on enthusiasm, on the right page, yeah, 54% in July, 53 now. So we may be saying we're going to vote, but we're not getting that much more excited about it. We're not getting that much less excited about it either, but, commercials are on, we're beginning to think, yeah, citizen duty, we're a very high turnout state. So there actually is a good chance a lot of people will vote.
Let's look at who these likely voters are by party ID.
So in July, you see a slight Democratic edge. 72% of Republicans said they're certain to vote. 75% of Democrats did. And independents, as always, are much less likely to vote. 63% there in July. When we come to this month, though, there's been a little bit of an uptick. 77 among Republicans, but 82 among Democrats. And that's one of the elements that's going on here is Democrats are, perhaps surprisingly, because midterm elections often have an electorate that's a little more Republican rather than a little more Democratic. But for the last two polls, we've seen slightly more Democrats saying that they are sure they'll vote this fall than among Republicans. And again, 68%, considerably lower among independents. Enthusiasm by party ID is about the same. It's 59-60 here in August, and enthusiasm among independents a good bit lower as well. So this is a developing picture. I've preached to you before that likelihood of voting, enthusiasm, certainty of voting is something that's pretty dynamic over the campaign. If you're in a period of good news for your party, you're more likely to say you're sure you're going to vote. But parties actually win and lose elections not just by who prefers them, but by who gets to the polls. So the dynamic, and I would expect these numbers to be moving as we go towards election day, is something we want to watch and see how it moves up and down and how the parties do relative to one another.
Charles, give us a sense of the party ID, how people self-identify and the likely and in the registered voter.
So in this sample, Republicans are 27%, Democrats 31%, and independents 38% of the registered voter sample. As it happens, those three numbers are exactly the average for all 23 statewide polls we've done of 19,000 people. So that's right with the long-term average. Among likely voters, Republicans and Democrats go up a little bit because partisans are more involved, right? And in this sample, it's Republican 28, Dem 34. Those are within a point or two of their long-term averages.
I'm going to turn the rest of this over to you unless you walk through a number of results, but what we're looking at here is that there are some pretty significant differences between people who are likely to vote and people who are less likely to vote in the way they view the world or their interests, obviously.
One good question that comes up fairly frequently is this question of, well, how do you know that the certain people are going to vote, but the less than certain people aren't? And I said earlier that this is not absolutely sure. Of course, some of the certain people will end up staying home. Some of the less certain people will be motivated and go. So it's not a black and white one-time decision. But I want to take you through and give you a sense of how different these two groups are. So what I'm referring to in the slides as likely are the likely voters, the people who say they're certain they'll vote. The less than likely are the people who say they're very sure they'll vote, plus the 50-50, plus the probably won't vote. Most of those people are actually in the very likely, though a fair chunk are in the 50-50 as well. Very few are in the probably won't vote. Okay? So the first question is, the percentage that say they follow politics most of the time. 63% of the likely voters follow most of the time. Just 27% of the less than likely say that. If we look at, are you enthusiastic about voting this November? 66% of likely voters, just 14% of less than likely voters. How about knowledge of one of the candidates that people are struggling with but have been learning about, Mary Burke? So this is the don't know rate for Mary Burke. For the likely voters, 26% can't rate her, but for the less than likely, a full 61% don't know enough about her to give her a rating. What about the Tea Party, which has been around and we've heard some talk of in the last few years? Likely voters, 20% can't rate the Tea Party, but among less than likely voters, nearly half, 46%. Don't know enough about the Tea Party to give it a rating. So those are some very clear indicators of just how great the gap is in political knowledge, political motivation, interest, and attention to politics that I hope gives you a reason to believe that our categorization between likely voters and those who are less than likely really does represent quite a sharp difference in the attitudes of these two groups. Now, campaigns certainly can try to reach out to those less than likely voters, get them motivated and get them to the polls. But I think you see from this last set of slides just how challenging that is for either party to do. Finally, there are some political differences, but they don't go in the same direction every time. So how about the state headed in the right direction? The less than likely voters are quite optimistic about the direction of the state, 64%, okay, to 50% of unlikely. But what about approval of Scott Walker? No difference whatsoever. It's 47 in both of the groups. So that again is that failure to translate the direction of the state into approval of the governor. What about the vote for governor, though? Now, here's among just the less than likely voters. A big 50 to 31% advantage over Burke. That's why when these people are included in the full sample of registered voters, the full sample moves in Walker's direction, right? Why might that be? Well, remember the 61% of these people that can't tell you anything about Mary Burke? They just haven't learned much about her. Now, maybe when they do learn, it'll be negative things about her, and it'll reinforce this. Maybe it'll be positive things about her, and it will negate this advantage. And we're pretty certain a lot of these folks will stay home on election day, and that will leave the job of picking our next governor to the folks that do show up, which I'm sure is all of you, right?
I have a hunch everyone here will show up. Let's take just a couple of questions here. Please raise your hand. Press down on the rim, not on the button, but on the rim, and keep pressing on it. See, Ryan, this is show and tell. You just keep pressing down on this, and we'll be able to hear you. So raise your hand. We'll take a couple of questions. On the, there you go.
Do you have any way of measuring what, if any, effect the lingering John Doe investigation has
Sure.
on the governor's race?
Yeah,
Here's the question.
What's the effect of the lingering John Doe investigation? This is where I was not lucky and didn't add a John Doe question before all the documents came out Friday. We have asked about that in the July poll. We found 75% had heard of the investigation. A little over 50% said it was just politics. About 42% said it was really something serious. That was a little more balanced towards just politics compared to the first Doe investigation, where they were almost exactly tied between just politics and something serious. Obviously, we've had developments since we went in the field. I should also mention about 550 of our 800 interviews were collected Thursday or Friday night. So that's before the Saturday morning paper would have arrived, before the vast majority of people could have heard anything about this late release. So I'm doubtful that the numbers would have been hugely affected if we had had a question in this time, but certainly it's something to consider for the next poll.
Going to move over to this side of the room. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit about the favorable or unfavorable outlook on Obamacare versus yes, we should take medication?
Yeah, this healthcare issue, as you've heard, is a little complicated and controversial. A couple of polls ago, we asked this same favorable or unfavorable view of healthcare reform with very much similar answers. But then we followed it up with what should or throw it out altogether. And so there you have this dilemma of what do we want about this thing that is substantially unpopular and has been unpopular since the day it was passed. But where our poll and national polls have found that doesn't mean the public really favors the throw it out strategy if it's not a majority of us. So I think it's nothing but complicated and does not admit an easy solution to it.
And Charles, we will be polling again several times before the election.
Yes. Keep an eye on the website. We put up an announcement about a week to 10 days or so before the events, and stay tuned.
And we'll also encourage you to check out the website, law.marquette.edu. We'll have all the results you can see, all the questions, all the crosstabs, everything for you folks who really enjoy politics. It's all there for you to peruse on the website. Also some posts about the poll and what it might say about where Wisconsin voters are at this moment in time will also be available on the law school faculty blog. Yes?
Can I just jump in?
Oh, sure.
We are posting both the likely voter and the registered voter results there, and the crosstabs for both of those for you Uber geeks that have to look at crosstabs. And we've added HTML tables to the crosstabs if you don't like the text formatting. Let me know if it works or fails.
Hey, Jeff, thanks so much for your time, your interest, and